Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. So this is part 3, the final part of my Carrera Go Porsche 997 build. In this episode I'll be finishing the chassis and hitting the track to see exactly what I've created. See if I've created something worth keeping or forgetting. So grab yourself a cup of tea, sit back and enjoy. Thank you very much. So the video got cut short at the end of part 2. But really all I wanted to show you was the squeeze out of the car body filler once I'd set the chassis down onto the block with these brass holders hanging down. That was really all. But anyway, on to the next stage. So I'm going to be unscrewing this chassis and then filing back these bulkheads here so that my 10mm back wheels will fit into the chassis and clear the bodywork. So on to fast forward. Okay, so with the chassis all filed out now, that is theoretically 10mm. So what we should end up with is a fitting wheel inside the body, and there is. It fits 100% into the body, but as you can see there is absolutely no allowance for the bearing. I'm going to file both sides of these down to generate some clearance. Okay, well I've taken about 1mm off of both sides there because it feels about right to do that. So pop that back in there, and now we're generating 1mm of inset on both sides, just on there. So that will now give me a little bit of clearance for my bearing. We need to generate a small amount of clearance for the tyre as well. So as you can see there, it's the bearing, back of the bearing is more or less level with the tyre. So that's obviously not going to work really. So we need to come back from that, which is why I've done 1mm 40 thou clearance on the actual chassis, because that will now give us 20 thousandths or 0.5 mm off the tyre as well. So that'll work out great. So now what I need to do is make the brass tray which will sit in here. So it'll come down, across and back up again, and it'll hold the two bearings. So that's what I'll do now on fast forward. And that's it. The little pod, all made and shaped up, ready to go into the car. So the way this works, or the best way I found that this works, if you put the axle in to here, and I pop a bearing in on either side. Oops. Like that. And then we can hook it in to the mount. One in there, drop it in and slide it back across. There you go. So the whole thing sits into the chassis just like that. And what I'll do now is I'll put some epoxy underneath this plate to screw the chassis down, put some epoxy under this plate and then leave it like that until the epoxy's gone off. And then once the epoxy's gone off, I'll drill these 4 holes through and I'll put brass rivets through the chassis to sandwich it together to give it some mechanical strength as well. So we're not just relying on the glue. The glue is really only there to bed the pod down, and then the rivets will actually hold it down for good. So I should get on with that. So that's it, all riveted into place with 4 nice copper rivets. So the next job is to get it back into the jig so I can glue the bearings into place. So that's it, the new bearings are in, and we can see that they're in exactly the same place because of how free this shaft still moves in its original fixtures. So the next job is to pop the old motor in and take a note of how high the shaft is relative to the axle, and then get this new motor in exactly the same position. Now I know that this new motor is 25 thou taller, so 50 overall, than the original motor. So I'm going to need to mill this chassis 25 thou down and a little bit further back to allow for the fact that this new motor is 50 thou thicker overall, 25 thou from centre to base. Okay, well that didn't quite go according to plan. It turns out we didn't really have 20 thousandths of an inch to play with on the bottom of this chassis, so I just milled it all the way through. So it'll be the same as other slot cars are, more or less, where the bottom of the motor is showing through. So what I'll do is I'll file this hole out nice and square and get the motor in the right position with the motor flush to the bottom of the chassis. Makes no difference, it's just a slightly different direction than I intended. Okay, that was all a bit of a struggle, but we got there in the end. So what I ended up doing was putting the original motor in its holder, getting a drill until I found one that was exactly the right distance between the end of the shaft and the axle, which is this one here, which happens to be 2.5mm, was just a little tight fit. So I cut the end of the shaft on the grinder and then kept on adjusting it down in depth until it was exactly the same gap. Then to round the end of this motor to give it a nice polished surface, I put this little 9-volt battery like this on my grinder and then ground the end on the grinder to give it a really nice gentle profile, and then put it on the wire wheel and a bit of polishing paper just to dull the end off and make it lovely and smooth. But it was done by running it on a battery to keep it nice and round. So now what we've got is we've got the motor fitting in there perfectly at exactly the correct height and the right gap here. So what I now need to do is make a little bracket in brass, a little L bracket, to go around this pip on the back of the motor and down into this rebate down here. Just a simple L with a hole in it, and then bond it into the bottom of the chassis, and then just 2 rivets, the same as I've done here, these copper rivets, 2 rivets in there, holding the back bracket in. Once that's done, this slot here the motor is sitting in is actually free to slide up and down. I don't know if you can see that. It slides up and down. So what I need to do is come in from the underside and cut a piece of plastic card that's that width and cupped, and it slides up into there, and it can, in fact what I could do is make a bit of brass and bring it round, do an L and bring it round onto this plate, scratch up this plate and then bond it into place, and then put a bit of bonding over the top, a bit of glue over the top, and that will hold the front of the motor in the correct position as well. It'll keep it to the top of that mounting. So that's what I shall crack on and do now. A couple of brackets and we'll have the motor in. So what I ended up doing was cutting a plastic insert to make up the bottom of this hole, so that when the motor goes in, it actually goes in there nicely. In fact, it's in there so nicely it holds the motor just by that hole. So what I shall do now is remove this little bit of excess plastic here and replace this hole for a piece of plastic with a little tongue. So this piece of plastic will be glued in and the tongue will extend into this area, having removed this piece of plastic here, so therefore trapping the piece of plastic that I've just put in completely. Then I shall glue the whole lot in together. So there it is, the little extra bracket at the front, all done. So the bottom half of that hole has been refilled back in. A little plate has been put on the inside of that magnet hole, a little tongue overlapping the plate I've just put in to encapsulate it into place. So now it's just a case of making the rear bracket in brass. And that's it. The little bracket is made, all glued up, now waiting to dry. As soon as it's dry, I'll put rivets through it, the same as I've done on the axle pod. So just a case of waiting. Okay, well, the glue is dried and I've riveted in. So now it's time to clearance, finally clearance this hole for the rear gear. Now there's a 2.2mm drill. It's just a hair smaller than the axle, but it does actually just about go through this gear without stressing the tolerances of the bore itself. So I'm going to use this 2.2mm drill to test fit the back axle. And there it is, all done. Motor in, pod in, gears are all in, everything's all running perfectly freely, no problems at all. So it's on to getting the tyres trued down to their finished size, because there's quite a bit of extra rubber on them at the moment, so too big. So we'll get those down to 16.5mm on the tyre truer and get the back wheels on. And there you go, all done. Tyres trued, motors in, all wired up. Got a little bit of weight in there, and the spring guide all in, all going nicely self-centering, no problems at all. And that's it, we've made it to the end. The chassis is done. The only thing left to do now is screw the body on. I haven't shown that, but all I've done is I've put 2 pieces of plastic cards in the front corner and a couple of holes in the front of the chassis with some countersinks. I've modified these little stainless steel bolts, screws, put a little tiny countersink on the underside so that they fit nice and snugly into these holes. So that's it. So I get the body on and we'll hit the track. So there you go, the end of another mega build of my little Porsche 997 Carrera Go. So I guess you're wondering, how well did it go around Crow Valley? As I said before, 55 seconds is a pretty respectable time, so this is what it did. As you can see, it's in the ballpark. Where it did lose a little bit was down the main straight. It just didn't have the top end speed, but through the bends it was fantastic, especially for a little 43rd scale car that's not supposed to be run without a magnet. It was quite impressive how it could be thrown round all the corners, but like I say, down the straight it lost a little bit. But I'm happy, it's a success. All my little modifications worked. It didn't de-slot, worth talking about. Really planted, very predictable, very smooth. I was quite impressed. It is well worth the projects, and I hope you really enjoyed it as well. I have got lots of other projects, so I hope you hang around for those. If you like this sort of content, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you could hit the bell, that would be awesome. Thank you very much.